Hi, my name is Sal Mercogliano. I'm an associate professor of history at Campbell University in North Carolina, and I am posting this video in response to the Cato's Institute video and conference they'll be having about the Jones Act soon. Last month, Cato Institute published a YouTube video entitled "It's Time to End the Jones Act," and on December 6, 2018, they'll be hosting a conference at the Cato Institute regards to the Jones Act. I'd like to take a few minutes here and talk about some of the comments and issues they raise in their video and kind of break down each one as they go. I am a former merchant mariner. I sailed for 3 years and then worked ashore for 4 years for the Military Sealift Command. I have a master's in maritime history and nautical archaeology and a PhD in military naval history. So I teach courses on maritime history and maritime policy. So a few things about it. Number one, they kick off talking about the Jones Act without a very good definition about what the Jones Act is. Published back in 1920, the Jones Act was really created in the backdrop of a few issues. One of the first has to do with the fact that the Jones Act was done to deal with issues emanating from World War I. The United States found itself in a position whereby its cargo, its goods were sitting on the docks because the U.S. really substantially lacked a merchant fleet. Since the end of the Civil War, the U.S. Merchant Marine had declined precipitously, and by the eve of World War I, the U.S. Merchant Marine was only 8% of the world. When World War I hits, most of the world's merchant fleets are unavailable to the United States, and so the United States found themselves without a merchant marine. The most famous part of the Jones Act is Section 27, which is what the focus of Cato typically is. However, the entire act needs to be looked at to put it into the context. One of the biggest attacks on the Jones Act by critics is two parts. One, it's made to save U.S. shipbuilders, and the other is the national security element. So I want to go through each point here as they discuss them. One of the first things they mention is the high cost of American ships, sometimes costing up to 8 times as much as foreign-built ships. Well, I would argue that's true in almost any industry at all, whether it's cars, aircraft, you name it. Section 27 of the Jones Act requires that ships participating in coastal trade be American-built, American-crewed, and American-operated. This doesn't seem to be a strange concept in many other industries. We don't have American-operated, non-American-operated vessels on our highways, in our airways. But issues, again, this is a very complicated issue. And the issue about American shipbuilding is intertwined with the carriage of goods and American operating of the vessels. One of the high points they also talk about is this. They use the example that shipping Texas oil to the Northeast can cost 3 times more than oil from Africa. Well, that's true, but where's the oil coming from in Africa? Is it Nigeria? Is it Libya? What's the condition in those countries? Why are they selling oil at low prices? Why is shipping at such a low price? You know, shipping domestically, while it may cost more, you're buying oil from an American source, from an American refinery, and you're also going through American ports. You're double handling the cargo, in the case using American ports. So naturally, it's going to cost less as it goes on. One of the other issues they mention, which is a key issue, I would always argue, is that higher costs push freight from ships to trucks. I would argue that's exactly opposite. In many ways, issues on the highways, low gas rates, low tax rates, low road rates, encourages the movement of goods on trucks and trains in the internal United States. Again, in the 1950s, post-World War II, the creation of the interstate highway system, the creation of pipelines, really eases congestion off the coastal trade. And one of the key things about the Jones Act had done is provide a coastal merchant marine that could be drawn upon in times of war. The interstate highway system, the pipeline system that crisscrosses the United States alleviates much of that burden. And I would argue that one of the big pushes today to really keep the Jones Act is this argument that Cato makes, is that we need to get the freight off the roads, ease the congestion on the interstate highway system, and get it back on ships, but it should be on American ships. The dual point they make, that the Jones Act ensures domestic shipbuilding capacity and ensures a ready supply of vessels in times of war and emergency. And there's several issues at play here that they both take. First, They talk about the fact that shipbuilding is only a fraction in the United States as it is around the world. Exactly true. Over 90% of the world's shipping is built in the Republic of Korea, China, and Japan. But the question is why? Why is it built there as opposed to other sections of the United States or the world? And the issue has to do with massive subsidies provided to many of these companies. For example, just recently it was announced that the Republic of Korea is talking about giving $1 trillion to Hyundai Marine to keep their shipbuilding industry afloat. China is a heavily state-regulated industry, same thing with Japan. And so a lot of investment is put into the shipbuilding industry in those areas, whereas very little is put into the United States. In 1982, the very last constructional differential subsidy, a use that was created as a result of the Merchant Marine Act in 1936, goes away. And we really see the precipitous decline of that. They make the point about 300 shipyards closing since the 1980s. Well, that goes hand in hand with efforts by the Navy to build the 600 ship Navy in the 1980s. In the 1980s, you had the dual dagger blows of the U.S. Navy sweeping into shipyards, filling shipyards up with government ship orders, while at the same time construction differential subsidies went away. And what you saw was major shipping lines, lines like Sealand, went and built their Econo ships over in Korea. You saw the construction of other ships overseas, APL, for example, building over in Germany and the Netherlands. So a lot of big shipbuilders that would traditionally have built in the United States get pushed out because of the needs for the 600 ship Navy and the lack of the subsidy, the differential, which really wasn't a subsidy, it was a differential to offset the higher cost of building in the United States. And you see the decline of shipyards. Now again, you can close all the shipyards in America, but the United States of America is a maritime power. We have the largest Navy in the world. Those shipyards that build Navy ships can also be building commercial ships, and I would argue you get an economy of scale. The shipyards would be more efficient if they were building more commercial ships, and that would placate and help the U.S. Navy in the building of their ships. They use this argument, which I find a very interesting one, and if you read this chart and you look at it and you listen to the way Cato explains it, it looks like that foreign flag shipping carried twice as much as U.S. flag commercial vessels did during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. But the graph is false in many ways. The large area in gray, it says U.S. government vessels, which represents over 60% of the cargo, is inaccurate. So for example, 19.1% of the ships in the gray were ships that were part of the Afloat Prepositioning Force. These were vessels that were either under long-term or short-term charter from the Merchant Marine. So they should be added to the U.S. flag commercial vessels. You add that total together, you get over 30% of ships or cargo is carried on U.S. flag commercial vessels. Notwithstanding that, the remaining U.S. government vessels are crewed by civilian merchant mariners. These are vessels either held in the Ready Reserve Force or held by Military Sealift Command, operated by commercial firms using commercial merchant mariners. And so this graph is a very kind of skewed depiction of what happened in Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. What happened as a result of Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm was an adjustment in how the United States carries its cargo. If you go fast forward to 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom, nearly all the cargo is carried by American vessels. They make a high point of talking about this vessel. They don't name the vessel, but it's the MV Magnitogorsk, which was a large roll-on, roll-off ship owned by the time of the Soviet Union, flagged in the Soviet Union, who operated between Leningrad all the way to the Far East. And they say that the situation was so desperate the U.S. twice requested transport assistance from Moscow. Well, advocates at Cato would tell you we're going to do that more often. We're going to ask other firms, other nations, to provide sea lift for us. So it shouldn't seem strange that we would ask other countries for this. In the case of the Magnitogorsk, the ship was on a route that would allow it to stop in Bremerhaven, pick up equipment and supplies, and carry it to the Far East. It was the Soviet government that didn't want to get involved and therefore halted it from taking place. Other nations have found not having a domestic merchant marine to be a hindrance. In 2000, for example, half of the Canadian Army found itself with its equipment stuck on a ship that was under arrest and unable to return the equipment back to Canada. Overall, they come up with this idea that the Jones Act is outdated, costly, and ineffective. However, recent studies will refute this. You can get into the study in Puerto Rico, which is a favorite one to talk about because U.S. islands and territories and possessions have to use the Jones Act. So Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, Alaska are always focused in on this. Yet a recent study talks about the impact of the Jones Act on Puerto Rico and found that costs were not too significantly different. There's always going to be higher transportation costs for different goods, but overall it wasn't different. Other study on the cabotage laws of the world talk about the fact that the United States is not unusual in having a cabotage law, a Jones Act. All of these then come together into the fruition of what Cato is trying to say. And I found it very interesting to note that this is the image that Cato is using on Twitter to talk about the Jones Act. It's not the 1920s anymore. Time to end the Jones Act. The reason I find this image amusing is the ship they depict there is a German passenger liner called the Vaterland. And in this case, the Vaterland is undergoing conversion into the USS Leviathan. In 1917, when the United States enters World War I, it does not have sufficient merchant marine to transport not just its own goods, let alone transport the American Expeditionary Force to Europe. It needs support. Half the American Expeditionary Force will be carried by Great Britain. A quarter of it will be carried by ships of the U.S. Merchant Marine, but the other quarter are carried by 20 intern German and Austrian passenger liners. The ship in question here, the Vaterland, will become USS Leviathan. USS Leviathan will carry over 100,000 troops to Europe. The U.S. has to basically use these intern German liners because it lacks an inherent merchant marine to do it. It has to rely on its allies. It has to rely on the good nature of the British, the French, the Italians, and a few other nations to get its American Expeditionary Force to Europe and then return it. And it became a big governing and bargaining tool in the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. And it's one of the impetuses that leads to the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. Vaterland became USS Leviathan, then became SS Leviathan, the flagship of the United States Merchant Marine, until replaced by a new ship which currently is rusting away in Philadelphia, the SS United States. And so I just want to counter the view put forth by Cato, and when they try to end the Jones Act, I would ask you to reconsider that and hashtag save the Jones Act. Thank you.